Hello, hello, hello. This is Jody with the Trunk Monkeys 2 channel, and you're listening to the Delusion, today's podcast. I don't have anybody lined up for today, and Chad is still getting settled in. And so today I thought I would start reading the book from Melvin Stamper, Fruit from a Poisonous Tree. You guys, I'm sure, will be learning a lot of new things that you didn't know about your government. So without further ado, here we go. The foreword. Melvin Stamper has experienced a remarkable life journey few of us will ever experience. His background in law and criminal investigation has enabled him to uncover facts of the crime of the millennium, exposing the motive along with the conspirators. The subtle and not so subtle threats from the government agencies that he was investigating merely served as a motivating force and confirmation of his life's investigation. Experience is one factor we must all use in determining credibility of another. And Stamper's experience in law, analytical thinking, and detective rivals that of any other in the investigation of a crime involving government subterfuge and cover-up. This author served his country as a U.S. Marine in Southeast Asia, a police chief, railroad special agent, CIA intelligence source, industrial engineer, pilot, law professor, legal researcher, private investigator, and ombudsman with the Department of Defense. His analytical skills were honed by all of his experience and education for the investigation of his life, the United States government. My personal relationship with the author has spanned 2 decades, and he never stops amazing me with the information he uncovers. Get comfortable and hold on to your hat. J. Randolph Appleby, municipal judge, retired, of Newark, New Jersey. Introduction. Several months prior to the writing of this book, I began questioning my motivation for doing so. I had a comfortable lifestyle with no real bone to pick with anybody, especially the government. I had achieved a comfortable financial position, well educated, firmly established in the legal profession, and most importantly of all, I had a loving, caring family. What then motivated me to take on both the state and federal governments, the proverbial biggest bullies on the block? The answer is that I had discovered that both the state and federal governments have been lying to and stealing from we the people. Of all criminals, the ones that are personally repugnant to me are liars and thieves. These species of criminal I cannot abide in any manner, from any source, especially the government. Ergo, the years of research uncovering the story you're about to read. The government and the international global elite have systemically stolen our wealth from our birthright as Americans. The title of this book, Fruit from a Poisonous Tree, explains the theft of our wealth and identity, and the book tells what we can do about it. This story is not about high drama, but it has that. It's not a story about insatiable greed. It has that also. This story is about the planned, deliberate destruction of the United States of America by the arch enemies of this nation who have been around since its inception, the global elite, whose identity you will discover. During my investigation, I became so overwhelmed by the government's deceit and unabashed arrogance that I went back to the history books trying to identify the point at which our republics swerved onto the destructive path towards democracy, where our creation, the government, servant of the people, became the master and we became the servant, where the non-productive, who are consumers to the public treasury, elect politicians who promote them even more government benefits at the expense of the majority of productive, wealth-producing Americans. That is the democracy we live in today and our founding fathers' worst nightmare. This change from a Republican form of government to our present democracy was silent and insidious. There are many contributors to this metamorphosis who we might fault both inside and outside of government, such as teachers, clergy, judges, and politicians, but laying blame would solve nothing. Ultimately, we, the people, are to blame. We are responsible. We have permitted both state, our and federal governments to have control over our children's education, which has resulted in the dumbing down of generations so that most of us can't detect the slow perversion of our freedoms. Thomas said, freedom is not free. The price you must pay for freedom is eternal vigilance. As a people, we have for many years been apathetic to the Congress, the president, and the judiciary, so much so that we never noticed the subtle diminishing changes that were occurring to our freedoms right in plain sight. We have not been vigilant. Somewhere along the way, this plan for a republic went dreadfully wrong. Without any constitutional authority, the republic was transformed into a democracy. Now the president makes law by executive order, again without constitutional authority. The Congress is powerless because of fierce partisanship and the constant pursuit of money from the international corporations needed to perpetuate their political lives. The result is that they do nothing to check and balance the other runaway branches of our government. The agencies that were created by Congress to make and enforce regulations and administer the draconian laws of Congress and the executive branch now answer to only the diseased, corrupted body of the executive branch, which answers to no one but the international cartel of bankers, philanthropists, and senior level policy wonks. These incomprehensible laws of Congress, especially the taxing statutes, are patently unconstitutional in their application to the citizens of the 50 states. But this seizure of the productive people's wealth for the benefit of the non-producing minority and the imprisonment of those who resist this theft have been ratified by the corrupted federal judiciary and Supreme Court. That briefly sums up our present-day democracy and the state of this union. Where did it all go wrong? You are about to find out, and you are not going to like it one bit. That's true. I truly believe that many of the problems we have with government and the judiciary today stem from the deliberate bastardization of the English language by those in government. The laws of English grammar are totally inflexible. It is absolutely impossible for any English-speaking nation that prides itself on the assertion that it is a nation of laws and not of men, without adhering to a strict discipline in the use of the English language and grammar, to be anything other than a nation of men without law. Proper English is essential to the drafting of these national laws. Otherwise, tyranny will always be the end result. The Supreme Court has pontificated that the Constitution is a living, breathing document, and that, as such, it must evolve with the changing society that it governs. This majestic body of legal intellectuals, in the process of an ever-evolving society, must interpret the organic Constitution for us, the ignorant masses. Preposterous. The Constitution is written in plain English so that anyone with a 5th grade education can understand its simple meaning. It isn't written in Russian or Chinese and doesn't need interpretation. Does the Constitution get cold or hot, sick or diseased? Does it get old and senile? The Constitution is not a living, breathing document. It is a dead tree that was processed into paper so that the eternal ideas and heavenly concepts of men governing themselves could be preserved for future generations. It was written by noble visionaries that we call our founding fathers. That is what the Constitution is, period. The visions and concepts immortalized in the Constitution cannot evolve without our society, because man, by the very nature of being man, rarely rises to a higher level of nobility. We as a species usually evolve to a lower base of decadence, immortality. One notch above a slug. That's the nature of man, and it has been so since the Garden of Eden. The United States Constitution, this document that the learned justices say must evolve to keep up with our society, is why we were the only nation in the entire existence of the human race to ever promise life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all of its citizenry, and then deliver on that promise. Look around and determine for yourself if we are not a moral society that must have an evolving constitution to keep up with us. Our government has taken from us our common law and the protections it afforded us and replaced common law with government-made vulgar law, called statutory law, that strips us from our freedom by creating legal fictions and compelling performance from those legal fictions, which common law did not. As a nation, we have more citizens in prison than any country in the world, over 2 million. And 90% of those crimes of which they are accused are victimless crimes. The law they violated most likely was paid for by corporations to protect them from us. We, however, are the problem because we operate like the tool of the new king, and we do his bidding without questioning whether the law is a good law or a bad law. It is our responsibility as jurors to ask those questions, but we have let the prosecutor and the judge tell us what the law means instead of using God's gift of intelligence to discern for ourselves. We are responsible for determining not only the facts, but also the law. If that were not true, then we would still have legal slavery and be prosecuting people for helping slaves escape under the Fugitive Slave Act. That law was interpreted and upheld by the courts of the time. Decent jurors who did not agree exercised their right of jury nullification, the most cherished right we have as Americans. We now have replaced morality with abortion on demand, and if we do not kill our children in the womb, we tax them to death the moment they are born. Does it not seem immoral to permit a Congress to spend money that it does not have so that every future generation will be obligated to pay from their labor and property for their entire life on a debt that is 60 or 80 years old? The moment your child is born, she has a debt to the Federal Reserve Bank Incorporated of $22,000 and rising. It is not only immoral, it is the thing of which violent revolutions are made. If we do not stop this insanity here and now, our grandchildren will, and it will not be pleasant. Waco, Texas is the example of what the new king wanted us to see, because that is our future if we do not comply with the king's demands. We permitted our government to negotiate and pass the NAFTA and GATT treaties, which guarantee that this nation will never again be an industrial or technological world power, assuring that our people are doomed to a third world agrarian life within the next 50 years. As I write this introduction, my book is finished, and I have reviewed its contents. Because of my knowledge of government corruption, I am becoming incensed while organizing my thoughts for this introduction. My antagonism was so great while I was researching that I expatriated my citizenship from the corporate United States. That expatriation document is in the first chapter of this book and sets the tempo for the remainder. I hope that if nothing else, you will come away with this reading, experience a wiser and more determined citizen in your state, with a passion for recovering what was ours and what was stolen from us. Chapter 1, Citizen Expatriation. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-braided harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp. Cries she with silent lips, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. By Emma Lazarus, New York City, 1883. 1798, Thomas Jefferson instructed that Congress had not unlimited power to provide for the general welfare, but only those specifically enumerated. Wilson Nicholas, a delegate to the Virginia Convention that ratified the Constitution, said, "Congress has power to define and punish for counterfeiting and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the laws of nations, but they cannot define or prescribe the punishment for other crimes whatsoever without violating the Constitution." Chief Justice Marshall said, "The police power unquestionably remains and ought to remain with the states." Until this past century, federal courts upheld the view that the federal government could deal only with crimes specifically mentioned in the Constitution. In 1911, the Supreme Court said, "Among the powers of the state not surrendered, which powers therefore remain with the state? Is the power so to regulate the relative rights and duties of all within its jurisdiction as to guard the public morals, the public safety, and the public health, as well as to promote the public convenience and the common good?" At the founding of this republic, there were only 4 federal crimes: treason, counterfeiting, piracy, and crimes against the laws of nations. Now there are 3,000 federal crimes, 300,000 federal administrative regulations, many of which are punishable as crimes, and about 85,000 local governments with 513,000 elected officials, or 1 in every 500 people. We have an estimated 45 million laws, state, federal, and local. God, the creator of the universe, gave us only 10 laws with which to live our lives. And although I fail often, I try to conduct my life by those 10 commandments. It would be impossible, however, to obey 45 million laws. Those millions of laws and the government enforcers are destroying our republic. In 1900, 1 in every $15 went for government use. In the year 2000, it is nearly 1 in every 2. We must contend with 65 times more laws than our grandfathers did at the turn of the 20th century. The most cruel and unjust of those being the tax laws. Every federal program takes on a life of its own, so it will be extremely difficult to transfer power from the federal governments to the states. It is difficult to change, much less kill or transfer a federal program once it has been established, even after it has outlived its usefulness. The New Deal view of an all-powerful central government must be replaced with a firm separation of powers if this republic is to survive. Increasingly, in the last 100 years, powerful corporate interests have deliberately subverted the intent of the founders by financing the appointments of judges who would enhance corporate and federal powers and weaken the constitutional system of checks and balances. While many today attack the New Deal as representing the demise of our constitutional government in America, the assaults actually began in the late 1800s when federal courts led by the Supreme Court started chipping away at the state's sovereignty. This allowed the federal governments to assume numerous duties and responsibilities that under the Constitution had been reserved to the states of the people. Recalcitrant Southern states did not turn to the Supreme Court to leave the Union before the Civil War, partly because the Constitution does not grant the federal courts the rights to control state sovereignty. The Constitution did not create a judicial supremacy, and there is extensive evidence that the founders never granted the Supreme Court the power to rule over the president, Congress, or the states. Every July 4th, we honor the signing of the Declaration of Independence. By signing that document, the founding fathers, many of whom were deists, pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to the premise that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights to be secured by a government that was subject to and inferior to the consent of the governed. The British pursued them as traitors to the king. Of the 56 original signers, 9 did not live to see freedom. 5 were imprisoned, and 17 lost everything they had. Their sacrifice for the Constitution of the United States has guided this nation through a continuing effort to bring liberty and justice for all. Can any of us do less? The courage of America's founders were based on their belief in God's providence. George Washington called America's liberties, quote, the object of divine protection, unquote. James Madison, president and signer of the Constitution, affirmed their beliefs, saying, quote, before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe, unquote. At the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin began the tradition of prayers in Congress, saying, quote, in the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, it is probable that an empire can rise without his aid, unquote. I'm sorry, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? If our liberty and nations were still under God's protection, none of us would be reading this book. We would be in full measure out in the pursuit of our happiness. By rejecting God's plan for our future, we have chosen to adopt man's temporal plan, and we must suffer the consequences of that choice. Many years of legal research has led me down many paths in pursuit of truth. I didn't receive truth in law school or at any time during my formal education, with the exception of a one-room schoolhouse in Kentucky. That school didn't receive any federal funds for education, so the subject matter the teacher taught was not restricted. Our teacher had a remarkable understanding of the national and state constitution, and that the framers' intent, along with Thomas Jefferson's negotiations with the state legislature, documented in the Kentucky resolutions. Fascinating reading them. Visionary in the present day. In later years, far removed from that one-room schoolhouse, what I received in public schools supported by federal grant money was revisionist history and omission of the truth in everything other than the sciences. After all, I had an education controlled by the federal government's money. I was taught what the federal and state governments wanted me to learn, nothing more, and certainly not the truth. The old axiom that, quote, truth is the first casualty of war, unquote, is as close to any truth that you will ever find in your investigation of the federal government. That being the case, we have been lied to by our government, and I have been at war with our national government for a very long time, and I believe that is the truth. As I write, for each of us within this country, our liberty is perishing. That liberty crushed beneath the constant growth of state and federal government power. More than ever before, the federal, state, and local governments are confiscating citizens' property, trampling rights, and decimating opportunities for any prosperous future you may have hoped for. Since 1933, a concentrated effort has been made to impoverish the people of America. Our wealth has been systemically stripped from us by a rapacious taxation and outright theft in the form of usury or interest and fractional reserve banking policy. Federal agencies publish an average of over 280 pages of new rulings, regulations, and proposals in the Federal Register each business day. The expansion of the federal code is one of the most obvious measures of the increase of administrative control over the citizen. The politicians' efforts to socially engineer society by an endless multiplication of penalties, prohibitions, taxes, and prison sentences is a dismal future. What has been lost in their effort is our freedom. The attack on the individual's rights has reached a point in our lives where a citizen has no right to the use of his own land if the bureaucracy determines it to be a wetland, no right to the money in his pocket or bank account if an IRS agent determines he has taxes owed, and no right to his property if a duck flying south for the winter lands in a puddle in his backyard. A man's home is his castle, except when a politician wants the land the house is built on for a low-cost housing project. In America today, a citizen's use of his own property is presumed illegal until approved by multiple zoning and planning commissions. Since 1985, federal, state, and local governments have seized the property of over 200,000 Americans under asset forfeiture laws, often with no more evidence of wrongdoing than an unsubstantiated assertion made by an anonymous government informant. Government officials now exert vast arbitrary power over citizens' daily lives from Equal Opportunity Employment Commission bureaucrats that can levy a $145,000 fine on a St. Louis small business because he did not have a $8.45 minorities on his payroll, to the Minnesota and Wisconsin Departments of Natural Resources, which regulate property so that you may not use the lake or swamp contained on your land because an endangered mouse species lives nearby. Federal agriculture bureaucrats can prohibit Arizona farmers from selling 58% of their fresh lemons to other Americans. Customs Service inspectors can destroy import shipments without compensating the owners. Federal bank regulators are officially empowered to seize the assets of any citizen for allegedly violating written or unwritten banking regulations. Federal regulations dictate what price milk must sell for, what size California nectarines can be sold, what crops a person may grow on his own land, what apparel items a woman may sew in her own home, and how old a person must be to buy a beer, even though he is old enough to die for his country. The Internal Revenue Service is carrying out a massive campaign against the self-employed that seeks to force over half of America's independent contractors to abandon their own businesses. NAFTA and GATT agreements are forcing small industries into bankruptcy because their customers have moved to Mexico or Indonesia. Government agencies are more out of control than ever before, and the Supreme Court, the supposed bastion of protection of the Bill of Rights, has ratified the power of these federal employees. Privacy is vanishing beneath the rising flood tide of government power. Government officials have asserted a de facto right to search anybody, anytime, on the pretext of terrorism. The average American now has no freedom from having government agents strip search his children, rummage through his luggage, ransack his house, sift through his bank records, and trespass in his fields. Today, a citizen's constitutional right to privacy can be nullified by the sniff of a dog. Federal officials have given rewards to hundreds of airline ticket clerks for reporting the names of individuals who paid for their tickets in cash, thereby allowing police to confiscate the rest of the people's money on mere suspicion of illegal behavior. Local police are conducting programs in 200,000 classrooms that sometimes result in young children informing police on parents who violate drug laws. The number of federally authorized wiretaps has almost quadrupled since 1980, except the ones intended to catch spies of our nuclear secrets. And the Federal Bureau of Investigation is trying to prohibit development of new types of phones that would be more difficult to wiretap. The demagogues in Congress are rabid with the intent of taking away our right to carry and bear arms. Could this description of events occurring in the United States today have applied to pre-war Nazi Germany? Freedom of speech and freedom of the press are increasingly under assault. The proliferation of vague federal regulations have had a severe chilling effect on the free speech of millions of businessmen who cannot criticize federal agencies without risking reprisal that could destroy them. Thanks to a 1992 federal appeals court decision and a late 1993 congressional uproar, even pictures of clothed children can now be considered pornographic, thus greatly increasing the number of Americans who can be prosecuted for violating obscenity laws by taking pictures of their own children. The government is manufacturing more criminals now than ever before. It is increasingly choosing the citizen target, creating the crime, and then vigorously prosecuting the violator. During the past 15 years, law enforcement officials have set up thousands of elaborate schemes to entrap people for crimes such as buying plant supplies, asking for a job, or shooting a deer. Hundreds of private accountants have become double agents, receiving government kickbacks for betraying their clients to the IRS. Total federal spending has increased from under $100 billion in 1963 to over $3 trillion in 2002. And as spending has grown, so has bureaucratic control and political power. Since 1960, the federal government has created over 1,000 new subsidy programs for everything from medical care to housing, from culture to transportation. Subsidies are the 20th century's method of human conquest. Slow political coup d'etat over one sector of the economy after society after another. Government subsidies have become a major factor in squeezing out unsubsidized developers, unsubsidized schools, unsubsidized theater producers, and unsubsidized farmers. The money is extorted out of the lifeblood of the citizen by rapacious and unlawful taxes, while the subsidies slowly smother his freedom. A government powerful enough to give you everything is powerful enough to take everything away. Former President Clinton set aside 1.7 million acres of Utah to be protected by the federal government. That sounds warm and fuzzy until you understand that the land federalized was the nation's largest reserve of soft coal. The electric utilities must now buy their coal for electrical generation from Indonesia. Soft coal, owned by the Lipo Group, LIPO, the same organization that donated millions to Clinton's election campaign. Beggaring the taxpayer has become the main achievement of the welfare state. The federal tax system is turning individuals into sharecroppers of their own lives. The private economy has become an agent of the federal government. At least 50% of the total productive resources of our nation are now being organized through the political market in the form of taxes. In that very important sense, we are more than half socialist. The average American now works over half of each year simply to pay the cost of government tax and regulation. High taxes have created a moral inversion in the relationship between the citizen and the state. Before the income tax, the government existed to serve the people, at least in some vague nominal sense. Now the people exist to provide financial gain for the state's mill. Federal court decisions have often bent over backward to stress that citizens' rights are nearly null and void in conflicts between the Internal Revenue Service. IRS seizures of private property have increased by 600% since 1980 and now hit over 3 million Americans each year. Not only do we have more laws and regulations than ever before, but the laws themselves are becoming less clear, consistent, or coherent. An example is the tax code. In 1913, a debate was held on the Senate floor regarding the first income tax under the 16th Amendment. Senator Elihu Root commented about the complexity of that first law. His comment was humorous then. It is hilarious now. Quote, "I guess you will have to go to jail. If that is the result of not understanding the income tax law, I shall meet you there. We shall have a merry, merry time, for all of our friends will be there. It will be an intellectual center, for no one understands the income tax law except persons who have not sufficient intelligence to understand the questions that arise under it." Unquote. All the confusion over an 80-page act then is exponentially compounded now by the current 10,000 plus page Internal Revenue Code, 26 USC, along with more than 30,000 pages of implementing Internal Revenue Regulations, 26 CFR, and some borrowed from 27 CFR. It is now practically impossible for citizens to keep track of government's latest edicts. Today, the law has become a tool with which to force people to behave in ways politicians approve, which is politically correct, rather than a clear line that citizens can respect in order. I'm sorry about that. Where was I? Today, the law has become a tool with which to force people to behave in ways politicians approve, which is politically correct, rather than a clear line that citizens can respect in order to live their lives in privacy and peace. With the proliferation of retroactive regulations, government agencies now have the right to change the rules of the game at any time, even after the game is over. The, quote, rule of John Ashcroft, unquote, whereby federal officials on a whim create new rules to bind people to and penalize private citizens, has replaced the rule of law. The classical concept endorsed by the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 as a restraint on government power. Each night we are deluged with cop shows that reveal how far out of the box the beast of government has crawled. Government agents dressed like military commandos, wearing black jumpsuits, bulletproof vests, and armament that would give a seasoned military force pause to reflect wear full head masks to conceal their identity. No one busy doing the constitutional work of the Republic needs to wear a ski mask concealing their identity. Criminals and outlaws wear masks, not constitutional officers. They bash in doors and throw the inhabitants to the floor, screaming children watching in horror as their parents are manacled and dragged off to prison. The government is supposed to set the example that we, the citizens, are required to emulate. When the government breaks the law, then there exists no law. We have anarchy. That, I am afraid, is the state of the Union as of today. In the famous Supreme Court case of Elkins et al. Versus United States 364 U.S. 206, the court, reinforcing judicial integrity, stated, quote, "In a government of laws, existence of the government will be imperiled if it fails to observe the law scrupulously. Our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches the whole people by its example. Crime is contagious. If the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for law. It invites every man to become a law unto himself, and it invites anarchy," unquote. The time in which Justice Brandeis spoke was a simpler time, and the government had not broken the chains with which the Constitution bound it down. Unfortunately, the federal judiciary has opted out of the separation of powers doctrine of the Constitution and now has become self-regulating. The courts do not maintain their independence as a judiciary. Without constitutional authority, the system elevates judges above the law. The courts are no longer our courts of justice or a bastion of freedom. With the passage of the War Powers Act of 1933, they have become the executive's tool. The judges are little more than organized crime families. They have invaded the people's courts and now only impersonate and give lip service to justice by exchanging obfuscation and sophistry in place of a judicial system, void of any form of judicial integrity. Enforcing judicial standards on judges under this system is impossible. Even though the court has ruled, the judges make up their own rules as they go or break the rules with impunity whenever it's convenient for them to do so. How can you take a judge to court when the judges control the court and have granted themselves immunity from prosecution? How do you call the police when it is the police who are breaking the law? The judge's dishonesty is contagious, and the government, as teachers, has sown the seeds of discontent and anarchy. The Lord God Almighty has granted a judge immense power to judge his creation, we, the people. But along with that power comes immense responsibility in that the Lord, on the day of judgment, will hold each judge to a higher standard of judgment. The people have learned their lessons well. They follow by example, and the example of the courts and the criminal justice system has led the people to behave criminally. just as Justice Brandeis predicted. Government now appears more concerned with dictating personal behavior and political correctness than with protecting citizens from the private violence of murderers, muggers, and rapists. In 1990, for the first time in history, the number of people sentenced to prison for drug violations exceeded the number of people sentenced for violent crime. The number of people incarcerated in federal and state prisons in 2001 was almost 4 times the number incarcerated in 1980. And America now has a higher percentage of its population in prison than any other country in the world. 2 million people. If those on probation and parole are taken into account, the number controlled by the justice system is over 6 million. So much for the, quote, the land of the free and the home of the brave, unquote, which is now just another oxymoron akin to, quote, military intelligence, unquote. Unfortunately, the more that government has tried to manage people's behavior, the more unmanageable American society has become. Gangs have replaced families, resulting in a greater proliferation of drugs and illegal weapons. Our babies becoming parents with no jobs or education, spiraling an entire generation of children into grinding poverty and third world expectations of life. We have lost our moral compass as a people and have embraced a secular view of morality rather than God's. This observable fact, as America has entered a new millennium, is the circumstance of the New World Order, as envisioned and planned for a very long time by the international banking cartel and the United Nations. Oppression has become more refined and more insidious in recent decades. We frequently see scenes like IRS agents dragging Amish tax registers out of their scanty homes, or the Los Angeles police beating a suspect. We can expect to see the frequency of similar scenarios escalate as we are pushed forward into a global government and the New World Order. The fact that only a minimum number of people physically resist government agents is not confirmation that the state is violating fewer people's rights. The level of tyranny imposed by government agencies is less evident today, primarily because the vast majority of citizens capitulate to government demands before the government resorts to enforcement. America is ripe for a cataclysmic revolution. The lack of an armed uprising is not evidence of a lack of discontent and hostility. 6 corporations presently control all forms of media, newspaper, TV, radio, etc., in the United States, and they have been diligent accomplices in a massive cover-up of federal crimes and oppression of the people. Many Americans apparently believe politicians and policy experts have been wise enough to create a government that does not crush the people it was created to protect and serve. The question of individual liberty is now often marketed as a question of a ruler's intentions towards a citizen. But lasting institutions are far more important than transient intentions. The last 75 years have seen the sapping of most constitutional restraints on capricious government power. American political assessment suffers from a predisposition to appraise government by exalted ideals rather than by inspired and shocking reality. We have a romantic tendency to judge politicians by their dictum rather than by their day-to-day actions, and a tendency to view the growth of government power by its promise rather than by its results. The decline of liberty is not primarily from specific acts of government, but from the collective force of hundreds of thousands of decrees, hundreds of taxes, and thousands of officials with unrestricted power over other Americans. Our political leaders say they have tried to improve the quality of life by multiplying the amount of intimidation, by militarizing police power, by giving one group of people the power of invention over others as to how they must conduct their affairs. The power accumulating is in a central government is not put on display at the Smithsonian Institute. It is exercised in the day-to-day life. The larger it becomes, the more oppressive it will become, regardless of the intentions of those who advocate larger governments. The average American's understanding of liberty and the threat to its survival has declined sharply since the nation's birth. The Massachusetts colonists rebelled after the British agents received, quote, writs of assistance, unquote, that allowed them to search any colonist's property. Modern Americans submit passively to law enforcement sweep searches of buses, schools, and housing projects without valid search warrants. Virginia revolted in part because King George imposed a 2-pence tax on the sale of a pound of tea. Americans today are complacent while Congress imposes billions of dollars in taxes, increasing the projected federal debt into double-digit trillions. Federal agencies have the power to act as prosecutor, judge, and jury in suits against private citizens. Maine revolted primarily because the British Parliament issued a decree confiscating every white pine tree in the colony. Modern Americans are largely complacent when local regulatory agencies impose almost unlimited restrictions on individuals' rights to use their own property. The initial battles of the Revolution occurred after British troops tried to seize the colonists' private weapons. Today, residents in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and other cities submit to de facto prohibitions on handgun ownership imposed by the same government that grossly fails to protect the citizens from the private violence. In 1775, revolution was largely a revolt against growing arbitrary power. Nowadays, seemingly the only principle is to have no political principle, to judge each act of government in a vacuum, to assume with each expansion of government power and nullification of individual rights will have no future impact. The founding fathers looked with horror at the liberties that they were losing, while modern Americans focus myopically on the freedoms that they still retain. America needs fewer laws, not more prisons. The founding fathers realized that some amount of government was necessary in order to prevent a war of all against all by trying to seize far more power than is necessary or granted by the Constitution over American citizens. The federal government is destroying its own legitimacy. We face a choice, not of anarchy or fascism, but a choice of limited or unlimited government. Because it is a necessary evil, it is necessary to vigilantly limit government's disruption of citizens' lives. We, the people, delegated to ourselves the responsibility as the ultimate protectors of the Constitution. We, the people, are the ultimate court. When our government is unwilling or refuses to abide by the constitutional mandates we required, it is our sacred duty to stand up against that government and to either alter or abolish it. But oppression remains an evil that must be minimized in a free society. The ideal is not to abolish all government, but to structure it so as to achieve the greatest respect for citizens' rights and the least violation of their liberty. The question is not whether Americans have lost all their liberties, but whether the average American is becoming less free with each passing year, with each session of Congress, with each new shelf row of Federal Register publications. American liberty can still be rescued from the encroachments of government. The first step to saving our liberty is to realize how much we already have lost, how we lost it, and how we will continue to lose our liberties unless fundamental political changes occur. I would propose that the Constitution be amended to require that the entire House of Representatives be composed only of females and the Senate be composed only of males. That would be a natural balance of power. It works in families. Why not Congress and the American family? The most recent example of congressional action and loss of liberty can be found in the new Patriot Act, short for Uniting and Strengthening Americans by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. This act of Congress primarily expands existing law, giving federal law enforcement agency greater intelligence gathering power, and has the effect of curtailing or eroding constitutional protection for citizens. In the wake of September 11th, most of us believed that the law might be reasonable in granting enforcement agencies these expanding powers. But the facts have been revealed by Congress do not support that contention. That tragedy occurred not because of inadequate anti-terrorism law, but because of the federal agency's own internal procedural failure. The Patriot Act does not, therefore, help us to fight terrorism better. What it does do is, number one, it upsets the balance of power in our government, putting unnecessary power in the hands of the executive, and brings us one step closer to what Chancellor Hitler achieved in pre-war Germany. Number two, increases the administrative burden on presently overburdened intelligence agencies making terrorism more difficult for them to fight. Number 3, destroys many of our hard-won, unalienable rights and liberties for which so many of our ancestors of our generation fought and died. The Patriot Act is a complicated law. I have assembled for this chapter the section which I feel are most troubling, specifically the Patriot Act. 1. Permits agents of law enforcement to enter and search your home in secret without ever informing you. The U.S. Constitution requires not only probable cause to search, but that you are notified of the search. Section 213 of the Patriot Act disembowels the notice requirements of the Fourth Amendment. Number 2, Section 216 of the Act permits agents of the government to tap your phone or computer without probable cause having been established. Under this section, a judge must authorize a warrant as long as law enforcement agents certify that the surveillance is, quote, relevant to an ongoing criminal investigation, unquote. No probable cause of criminal activity is required to issue the warrant, and the criminal activity does not have to have anything to do with terrorism. This violates the probable cause provision of the Fourth Amendment. So, for all intents and purposes, the Fourth Amendment is a dead letter. Number 3, in addition, Section 218 permits the government agent to carry out secret searches and wiretaps without showing probable cause, merely by certifying that there is a, quote, unquote, significant foreign intelligence purpose. This also evades the Fourth Amendment protection. Number 4, Section 411, in tandem with Section 802, expands the power of government to designate a group as a, quote, foreign terrorist organization, unquote. Any group which endorses so-called, quote, terrorist activity, unquote, which under 802 may be authorized a lawful protest activity, can be designated as a terrorist organization. This would enable governments to designate such groups as the California tree huggers, protesters in Puerto Rico objecting to bombing of their land, or those protesters against the World Trade Organization as terrorists, such as in Seattle, New York, Chicago, and Washington. Goodbye, First Amendment. Number 5, Section 411 also allows the governments to indict anyone who provides material support or assistance to a terrorist organization. It is now possible for the federal government to determine that a domestic terrorization organization is in fact a terrorist group, i.e., the Michigan Militia, or Save a Patriot, American rights litigators, or any group who may disagree with government policy. One man makes the determination of terrorist, the president. No evidence is necessary, and no court can stop that designation. No more Fifth Amendment. Number 6, Section 412 of the Patriot Act permits the government to arrest and detain immigrants indefinitely for nothing more than a visa violation. In fact, of the 1,200 known immigrant detentions since 9/11, the ACLU determined that only about 5 had been detained on terrorism-related charges. Number 7. Section 802 creates the crime of, quote, domestic terrorism, unquote. This criminalizes any acts of any member of the public that merely appear to the government's determination to be intended to, quote, influence the policy of the government by intention or by intimidation or coercion, unquote, or to, quote, intimidate or coerce a civilian population, unquote. This section would make just about any act of civil disobedience in protest against government policy into an act of domestic terrorism. Anyone who responds in writing to the IRS by objecting to one of its decisions could and probably will be labeled a domestic a terrorist. There goes the Fifth Amendment. Our Congress, at the urging of the President and the Attorney General, has enacted criminal, unconstitutional legislation. As an example of its new application, we now see what is planned for the rest of us. Attorney General John Ashcroft said, quote, if you don't agree with the government, you are a terrorist, unquote. Attorney General Ashcroft pushed the U.S. Patriot Act through an overwhelmingly dim-witted Congress soon after September 11th. He had subverted more elements of the Bill of Rights than any attorney general in American history. This is the same man who was beaten by a dead man in his bid for the Senate. Under the Justice Department's new definition of, quote, enemy combatant, unquote, which won the enthusiastic approval of the President and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, anyone can be defined as an enemy combatant, very much including American citizens, and they can be held indefinitely by the government without charges, a hearing, or a lawyer. In short, incommunicado, goodbye the entire Bill of Rights. Now more Americans are also going to be disposed of every fundamental right in our system of justice and put into camps. Ashcroft's terrorism FBI guidelines. Quote, the nature of the conduct engaged in by a terrorist enterprise will justify as inference that the standard for opening a criminal justice investigation is satisfied, even if there are no known statements by participants that advocate or indicate planning for violence or other prohibited acts, unquote. That conduct can be simply intimidating the government, according to the U.S. Patriot Act. This book would qualify under those guidelines. The following words of Thomas Jefferson from the Kentucky Resolutions sounds as though they were written yesterday in describing the Patriot Act. Quote, that if the acts before specified should stand, these conclusions would flow from them, that the general government may place any act they think proper on the list of criminals and punish it themselves, whether enumerated or not enumerated by the Constitution as cognizable by them, that they may transfer its cognizance to the president or any other person who may himself be the accuser, counsel, judge, and jury, whose suspicions may be evidence. His order, the sentence, his officer, the executioner, and his breast, the sole record of the transaction, that a very numerous and valuable description of the inhabitants of these states being, by this precedent, reduced as outlaws to the absolute dominion of one man, and the barrier of the Constitution thus swept away from us all, no rampart now remains against the passions and the power of a majority in Congress to protect from a like, what is that word? Expiration. Expiration. Or other more grievous punishment. The minority of the same body, the legislators, judges, governors, and counselors of the state, nor their other peaceful inhabitants who may venture to reclaim the constitutional rights and liberties of the states and the people, or who, for other causes, good or bad, may be obnoxious to the views or marked by the suspicions of the president, or be thought dangerous to his or their election or other interests, public or personal, unquote. Jefferson's statement is as valid in 2003 as it was in 1798. It lends a chilling historical perspective to the President Patriot Act and our present condition compared to events in America in 1798, brought on by the Alien and Sedition Act, the Whiskey Rebellion. Congress and the other branches of the federal government are not a party to the Constitution. They are products of it. The Constitution vests Congress with certain delegated authorities under Article 1, nothing more. Within its own borders, state authority is antecedent to that of the United States, and as parties to the Constitution, the several states have both the right and responsibility to correct their agent, the United States, when ambition seeks to abuse or expand powers which have been delegated. Of more immediate importance, where the instant matter is concurred, those who exceeded the law, whether of the state of the United States, are accountable to the law of the land and ultimately to the people of the land within the several states. Operation under color of law is outlaw, criminal, and accountability must be in law. Judges, magistrates, attorneys for the Department of Justice, and enforcement people do not have immunity when they exceed the law as it is written. This war on terrorism is not a war at all. Congress is the only constitutional body that can declare war. It is a convenient tool being used by the president to expand power and control over each of us citizens. Nothing more. The government will not be happy until the last vestiges of our Constitution are torn from us, leaving no protection from the servitude expected from us all. The federal government has never kept its word in either the conduct of internal policy, the Constitution, in treaties within the Indians, or international policy. The course of conducts being displayed by the government is merely ensuring that the new generations of terrorists are being created at home as well as abroad. The Constitution was written and the federal government created in order to ensure that all of our liberties were protected, even during times of war. They have failed miserably in that task. Ashcroft now says that, quote, "We will protect you, but some of your liberty must be surrendered to enable us to protect you," unquote. Rubbish. It is time that all Americans with courage say to the government, "Go to hell." There can be no higher expression of patriotism than opposing your government when you believe they are wrong. That should be the responsibility of our state governments, but they have brought into the federal agenda because it expands their power and control over us, and they are no better than the federal fascists that they emulate. Freedom is a word not often reflected by us. Thomas Jefferson said, quote, "Freedom is not free. The price we must pay for freedom is eternal vigilance," unquote. Collectively, we have not been vigilant, and now we can see the result of our apathy. It is not too late to correct our agent, the federal and state governments. Individually, we are not a threat to the vested interests of the new king, but collectively, we can still control it if we wake up and smell the dead, rotting corpse of this once great republic. Together, we must demand that they cease and desist in their plan for world domination and control over us before the United States of America crashes, smoking and burning upon the scrap pile of history. When I left the battlefield in Southeast Asia, I vowed that I would never again take up arms against another human being, and I never will. But as long as I breathe, as long as I have breath in my body and a right of freedom of expression, I will educate, agitate, and indoctrinate as many of my fellow Americans as possible in order to stop or delay this march into madness that we are now on. The administration forced a vote on the Patriot Act before many legislators even had a chance to read it. That is the way the world elites always slip in legislation that destroys our freedom. That is the way the War Powers Act of 1933, the Federal Reserve Act, and the 16th and 17th Amendments to the Constitution were all passed into law. Then, NAFTA, GATT, and countless other laws were shoved down our throat because Congress had no backbone and are co-conspirators in treason. The Patriot Act passed by a majority of 337 to 79. We must prevent these changes from becoming malignant and spreading to the body politic. Insist that the Congress will require these anti-terrorism laws to be re-examined in a few years before they become permanent. This is your only chance to protect what may end up being the most significant event in our nation's history. Events that your grandchildren will not forgive you for if you do nothing. Some people argue that we live in a lenient society that has more than enough liberty, that we can afford to lose some. Others have argued that only those people who are criminals or buying and selling drugs or gun owners have concerns about the Bill of Rights. Some might think my perception is too negative. They're probably correct. But being a sentinel for freedom is my responsibility and yours as well if you wish to remain a great nation. On my way to Hawaii 3 weeks after the New York tragedy, I was sitting next to a young woman who worked for the World Bank in Washington. She maintained those sentiments. As I excused myself and moved to another seat, I told her that I was not going to spend the next 7 hours listening to an idiot mouth concepts about which she had absolutely no understanding of the gravity of her conclusions. In my opinion, most of the general population who espouse those beliefs do not have the brains God gave a goose. They don't realize that once the freedom is given away, it will never be returned. And the rights which are used by criminals to evade incarceration are the same rights which protect each of us. If one is denied that right, so too will all be denied that right. In undergraduate school, I took several American history courses as that subject had been of interest to me for the last 30 years and is an excellent foundation for law. But I discovered that what was written in the history books was not the same as what was written in the settled case law of the same time period. The law is where the true history of a nation is found, not in a revisionist's history book. This nation's history is composed of many great dreams and ambitions with which were sacrificed upon the altar of pragmatism, necessity, circumstance, and thousands of dead heroes. Our constitutional rights are like that. The government has never simultaneously observed all the first 10 amendments to the Constitution for the United States of America as they were actually written. The government's, all three branches, has always been quick to say, quote, "That's not what they meant," unquote. As if we are too stupid to read the simple language of that compact and understand the founder's intent. And that's in good times. In dreadful times, when things get difficult and Americans are concerned, distressed, or angry, things get suddenly worse. This has been true from the very start of our nation. Here are some examples of American history that we were not taught in school. The second president, John Adams, a founding father, in parentheses, a forefather of yours truly, someone who should have known better, got the Alien and Sedition Act passed. That law allowed the deportation of any non-citizen who was judged to be dangerous to the United States, even if the country was not actually at war. No trial was required. The Sedition Act made criticizing the government a prison offense. These laws were passed and used to silence the public's opposition to Adams' foreign policy, especially used to imprison newspaper publishers of the opposing political party. Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. A long time ago, right? That may be so, but it was the beginning of the tradition within our body politic. In the 20th century, there was an infamous Sedition Act in World War I. It was used to jail social reformers, activists, and other people with whom the government disagreed, and if they were non-citizens, to expel them. Specifically, It made speaking out against war a prison offense. Prominent journalists and civil libertarians were jailed for merely reading from the Constitution. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the famous liberal Supreme Court justice, voted to uphold this curtailment of the First Amendment with his now famous statement comparing the activism for peace during war to shouting fire in a crowded theater. I have often believed that that a judge is a lawyer with a 50 IQ, nothing more. The next shameful event in our history, which still plagues us to this day, was the, quote, War Powers Act of 1933, unquote. This act permitted President Roosevelt to make law in the form of executive order, bypass Congress, and create his socialist state. We, citizens of this country, were ever after to be considered enemies of the United States, who must be licensed to engage in any commercial activity. With the aid of the Federal Reserve, the same people who created the Depression, the president confiscated our gold and silver coin and replaced it with worthless pieces of paper and a debt system that will eventually destroy this great country. Our land and our labor were pledged to the Federal Bank Reserve Bank, Incorporated, as collateral for a debt system that could never be paid. How can this most important event in our history not be taught in school? Everyone knows about the imprisonment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. All people of Japanese descent, even natural-born Americans, were subject to detention in prison camps. The federal government jailed 120,000 men, women, and children for 3 years for the crime of being Japanese. The Supreme Court upheld the capture, internment, and the effective seizure of their property. That fact alone confirms my theory that they all have IQs of 50 or lower. The Smith Act, also passed during this period in 1940, before America's entry into World War II, mandated the fingerprinting and registration of all aliens in the United States. To be an unregistered alien was against the law. This law also outlined all organizations that advocated the overthrow of the government. Perhaps a reasonable measure in war, but this law passed during peacetime. The Smith Act was abused to jail labor leaders, socialists, and communists who were opposed to the ways of the robber baron capitalists, the very ones who created the conditions for the Great Depression. The Red Scare of the 30s and the communist witch hunt of the 40s and 50s ruined many American lives. Their only crime was to know the wrong people, or to hold liberal opinions, or to have such opinions in their youth, and the gall to stand up to demagogues and others who used anti-communism as the key to increasing their own power. The 1950 Internal Security Act, passed by a supermajority to override Truman's veto, required registration of people and groups who were communists or who had beliefs similar to communists. It created detention centers around the country, which would be filled with FBI-identified subversives if the president declared an emergency. Those detention centers are still in existence, and new ones have been built all over this country to hold us. There are over 43 of them at present under the direct control of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. Most recently, many are familiar with the history of the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movement. Did you also know that the FBI's Operation Co-Intelligence Program, or COINTELPRO, approved at the highest level of government, had its object of suppression of those who worked to change the system? It was used to intimidate the membership, discredit leadership, and even put into jail those who fought for freedom and peace in a manner that was not only grossly immoral, but completely illegal. That was only 30 years ago. And there is Watergate and Nixon's inches-thick list of enemies. He used the power of the IRS, FBI, Customs, and other federal agencies to harass or eliminate his political opponents and everyone he suspected of disloyalty or political opposition. That took place only 25 years ago. And now, after 25 years of drug war and the drug war-friendly Supreme Court, we've seen our protections under the Fourth and Fifth Amendments eroding to nothing. All of these deprivations of liberty are always under the pretext of some alleged war. We are at a watershed point in our nation's history. Not everyone who cries, quote, "we must fight terrorism," unquote, is really a friend of the Republic and freedom. Some people think that we should live in a society with a lot fewer civil rights. They believe that some opinions should be illegal. Some activism should be forbidden. Is this the type of individual that permeates the Congress and the federal judiciary? Will these new laws affect you? Maybe not at first. They'll be used to stop people with whose opinions you disagree, to jail civilian militiamen from Montana and Michigan, to put a stop to the KKK, ACLU, Operation Rescue, or Greenpeace. Depending on your political beliefs, that's a good thing, right? By the way of judging such a law is not how it operates today, but how it will operate when your most feared enemy is in control. Who is your most feared enemy? If no one you know now qualifies for that position, imagine what use these new laws could be put to use by Hitler, Stalin, Osama bin Laden, or even by George Bush Jr. How would you safeguard your freedom and those of your friends and your families when your opinions are labeled as terrorist? My point is this: freedom walks a very narrow road. On one side of that road stands conformity, censorship of ideas, and the use of force to compel people in their role as a citizen or antagonist. On the other side stands social engineering and political dissent. The only thing in the middle of that road is dead skunks and ignorant people. That narrow road is supported by the Bill of Rights and the settled case law, which supports our rights. There's nothing magical about the Constitution. It's a dead tree ground into paper, so those immoral, heavenly concepts of freedom and self-government could be memorialized. It's a document written by people, for people, and interpreted by other people. It can be followed or it can be ignored. If it is followed, there are few precious fundamental restrictions on government actions against the individual. There is in the Constitution, for instance, A guarantee of due process of law before life, liberty, or property is taken from you. This isn't a guarantee that you won't be wrongly prosecuted or that you won't be investigated or even punished for your beliefs. It's only a guarantee of exposure to other people, your fellow peers, and the press, including some judges who will be watching to see that the rules are being followed. Sometimes that exposure is enough to make the difference. Sometimes it's not. The judges are there only to make sure that the rules were followed. Justice does not reside in the courtroom. If you want justice, go to church. That's in God's hands. All the judiciary cases about is if all the judiciary cares about is if the rules were followed, nothing more. The same Congress that legislated our freedoms away writes the rules. But when by our apathy we set aside those few guarantees contained in the Constitution, when we allow searches made in secret, the seizures of property without trial, the detention of people without proof of a crime or opportunity to defend themselves, then that form of democracy becomes a paradigm for disaster. Our silence is freedom's death knell. People suffer because those who have and exercise power are imperfect people. They always make mistakes. They get eager in protecting us and, in doing so, forget that the actions of the overeager bureaucracy are the clear and present danger to the people. Some of them have a desire to exercise and abuse their power, to silence their antagonists, to persecute those who are different from them, to make others bow to their demands. Those types of individuals make great prison guards, politicians, and judges. A strongly respected constitution helps keep a restraint on all of that. Nothing but God can stop a government that is resolute to ignore its constitution. The War Powers Act, Alien and Sedition Act, Red Scare, Watergate, COINTELPRO, and now the Patriot Act are examples in our shameful history that illustrate a government completely out of control. But the Constitution was drafted in order to make things safer by introducing safeguards. Competing interests and the separations of powers doctrine between these three branches of government, each jealously protecting its own power, are the instruments by which our freedoms are enforced should be. When they are not, then you'd better watch your ass if your opinions are unpopular, unpalatable, or even dangerous to the status quo. The first rule of watching your ass is to make sure you don't look or sound like an enemy of the state. It's called the ostrich strategy. Self-censorship is always the first step in the loss of freedom, lest you draw attention and the powers of those who might do you harm for speaking your opinions. Self-censorship makes it easy for further, more draconian steps to be taken. As no one says, quote, "Stop, this is unconstitutional," unquote. We fear that if we said that, we might be singled out for our government's reprisal. Quote, "When Hitler attacked the Jews, I was not a Jew, therefore I was not concerned. And when Hitler attacked the Catholics, I was not a Catholic, and therefore I was not concerned. And when Hitler attacked the unions and the industrialists, I was not a member of the unions, and I was not concerned. Then they attacked me and the Protestant church, and there was nobody left to be concerned, unquote. This quote is from a pastor who opposed Nazism in Hitler's Germany. He was speaking for the reaction, or lack thereof, of all the people of goodwill in Germany to the events that transpired there. It's the silence of the people of goodwill that allows manifest evil and fascism to entrench itself. Quote, evil can flourish only when men of good will do nothing, unquote. It is an ancient maxim that has profound meaning in our time. I am not saying that the US government is filled with Nazis. God willing, that specific species of human lunacy will never return. But the lessons learned in the fight against fascism should always live within us like a festering boil on the surface of our consciousness. Don't be silent. And don't censor yourself. Speak out against those in power and let them know you disagree and that you are watching their every move. This is the responsibility of citizens in a republic. I believe a republic's strength does not result from voting. In our country, half don't vote because there isn't much in the way of a choice. There is Daryl, my brother. There is Daryl, my brother Daryl, and my other brother Daryl. Not a penny difference between them. But we still have a strong country because people have a right and feel safe in expressing dissatisfaction. This operates as a relief valve for our frustrations and criticisms of those in power. There is a partition between our leaders and us that has grown larger with each passing year and each new shelf row of Federal Register publications. Many of our representatives are hearing only the call from the President and Attorney General to give them more power in order to make us safe from terrorism, no matter the cost, no matter the loss of precious freedom. Absolute safety can be achieved only in a police state, and then it is the state that is the source of all terrorism. That has been the story of human societies from time immemorial. Few of these new laws are made for the prosecution of a war on foreign terrorists. We already have every legal tool needed to do this. The purpose of most of these changes is for the collection of more information about Americans without the regulation of a judge and the restrictions imposed by the Constitution. The law already allows intelligence and investigative agencies to spy on foreigners without any serious obstacle. These laws can be only for the monitoring and imprisonment of those living in the United States who have different opinions of what it makes for a fair and just society, citizen or foreigner. The government's opinion may be diametrically opposed to your own. Our war right now is against terrorism in the Middle East. The first people targeted in this country will be Arabs and Muslims. Since I am not Arab or Muslim, it is none of my concern. Next will be the civilian state militias. Since I am not a member of the militia, it is none of my concern. Next will be the Christians with their belief in a power higher than the government. Will there be anyone left to object? We, as a unified voice of we the people, must, when the first of us is targeted, shout out from the highest hill, go to hell. That is the end of the first chapter. Yeah. Oh. Let me get back to my live stream. I hope everybody could hear me. I don't know. Hang on. So, could you all hear me okay? Hello, anybody there? Encouraging in case you needed it. Aw, Tree, I love you. Holly, I love you. Okay, well, I've got 3 minutes until the end of this podcast. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I hope you could hear me okay. I hope I didn't make too many mistakes. And I will continue reading the second chapter next Monday unless I get somebody on. My co-host, he's trying to convince his brother to get Wi-Fi so that he can have a signal. So yeah, this the information that is in this book is just mind-blowing, and that was just a tease. The first chapter was just a tease. The cover of the book. American blacks were set free as slaves, but never as free men. All you own belongs to the Federal Reserve. You are made a slave by the way your name is spelled. The Patriot Act emasculates the Bill of Rights. The Constitution was set aside during the Civil War and has never been in effect since. So when you hear people talking about, the Constitution this, the Constitution that, that's just bogus. It's all bogus. Okay, well, my time is up. I must return to work. I have a full-time job, split shift day, and join me next Monday from 12 to 2 Mountain Time for Chapter 2. Until then, peace out, be well, and have a beautiful day.